Sir Keir Starmer's approval rating has plummeted to its lowest level on record amid a growing cronyism scandal. The new poll shows almost two-thirds of voters think the government is more interested in serving its own interests than those of ordinary people. How can that possibly be, having cut winter fuel payments so you can pay rail drivers? How can that have happened? That's a strange one, isn't it? Well, let's go back when he was enjoying phenomenal success. Sir Keir speaking outside Number 10, 56 days ago, all but 2 months, he'd become Prime Minister.
Good afternoon. I have just returned from Buckingham Palace, where I accepted an invitation from His Majesty the King to form the next government of this great nation.
You have to, of course, point to the challenges that he took on board, obviously, and the lamentable way in which the country had been treated. But his personal approval rating has fallen by 27 points. Among the reasons? Well, the government's repeated talking down of the economy, with the PM warning earlier this week a painful budget is ahead in October, in spite of the UK enjoying the strongest growth of all G7 economies so far this year. There are also fears that taxes such as fuel duty, employers' NI and capital gains tax could all be hiked in that budget. This in spite of what Sir Keir said on LBC when he was taking your calls during the election campaign as recently as June.
We've been really clear we're not going to be raising tax on working people. So, as you rightly say, that means no increase in income tax, in national insurance and in VAT.
Council tax?
Then, well, on top of that, Sid, the approach we've taken is this. We've published our manifesto with our plans in it, Sid. Every single thing in that document is fully costed and fully funded. So we've worked out how much it will cost and we've worked out or explained where the money will come from.
Sid obviously is the caller who put the questions, just to explain why Sir Keir referenced him. Now, arguably, the most controversial policy announced since the government took office was the decision to withdraw that winter fuel allowance from all but the poorest pensioners. But in spite of the growing backlash, Sir Keir claimed he'd been left with no choice during that Downing Street press conference earlier this week.
I didn't want to have to deal with the winter fuel allowance for pensioners. But we have to fix the NHS. We have to fix our homes, our schools. And pensioners rely on them in the same way as everybody else does. So I'm not going to preempt the budget, but I'm absolutely not going to accept that the inheritance that we have isn't anything other than dire.
And he did use the word, quotes, painful to describe the upcoming budget. And finally, the most recent group that Sir Keir and his team have caused a rift with is the hospitality sector, many of whom are up in arms over the leaked news yesterday. They'll soon be banned from smoking outdoors at pubs and restaurants. Here he is defending the move, speaking to reporters in Paris yesterday.
Over 80,000 people lose their lives every year because of smoking. That's a preventable death. It's a huge burden on the NHS. And of course, it's a burden on the taxpayer. So yes, we are going to take decisions in this space. More details will be revealed, but this is a preventable series of deaths. And we've got to take the action to reduce the burden on the NHS and reduce the burden on the taxpayer.
It's a pretty graphic number, 27 points, but let's contextualise it by bringing Joe Twyman, co-founder of Delta Poll, into the conversation. And let's look at others who were elected, who won general elections, because there are some distinctions, of course. People such as Tony Blair, David Cameron, Boris Johnson. How does he compare? Joe, good morning.
Good morning, Nick. Well, to start with, the comparison with Tony Blair is a very, very distant one. Tony Blair did extremely well, both compared to other leaders, but also compared to other politicians generally. At one point, he was the most popular politician on record. So Keir Starmer is in a very different position from that. And it's worth pointing out, of course, that different polls ask slightly different questions. So this is not like comparing something like voting intention. But the broad story is clear. And that's that in 2010, the last time there was actually change of party in government, David Cameron had positive leadership ratings from the election in May right up until the end of that year. After the 2015 election, though, Cameron was in negative territory almost immediately, broadly where Starmer is now. That's a lot better than Theresa May was after 2017. She was in a much, much worse position. But then that election result had damaged her to an extent to which she never really recovered.
Yes.
And then Boris Johnson was in positive territory just in the early days after 2019. But then we went into COVID and everything went a bit strange. So we can broadly say that Starmer is doing better than May and about as good as Cameron in 2015, but not as good as Johnson in 2019, and not nearly as good as Cameron in 2010, which you could argue is the only reasonable comparison.
Joe, these numbers are your meat and drink. In reality, taking away the headlines are being enjoyed by some newspapers this morning. Is there cause for concern here?
If I were the Labour Party, I would not be concerned for two short-term reasons and one long-term reason. The first is that it's August, and admittedly the end of August, but relatively few people.
You're right. Yeah.
Relatively few people are paying attention at the moment. But also, more importantly, the Conservatives have, for all intents and purposes, no leader. And so they can't really take a political advantage from this, because what I'm talking about is the absolute scores. But we know it's the relative scores. In other words, how Keir Starmer does against his opponents that's important. Because Tony Blair has talked, and this is the long-term point, Tony Blair has talked about the fact that that Labour would really not bold enough in his view in 1997 and were too worried about polls and headlines and things like that. Maybe Keir Starmer is happy to return to the days of midterm blues and that sort of thing if he thinks it can actually get big things done against a Conservative Party that is not strong enough to really fight him.
Joe, lastly, I take you to the Rose Garden this week, and I said at the time, I think, with the exception of declaring war or COVID lockdowns, it was the most grim message I've ever seen from a Prime Minister. Is there a danger that he can over-egg that? I mean, even in the Second World War, Winston Churchill was talking about the sunlit uplands, and I think Roosevelt in the Great Depression said we've only nothing to fear but fear itself. It's a very different message here that effectively seems to suggest we're all done for.
That's right. And if polling over the last century has taught us anything, it's that you need a carrot and you need a stick. And Keir Starmer so far has had a lot of stick, but we haven't had much carrot, at least yet. Maybe maybe we can look forward to mixed metaphors. Maybe we can look forward to carrots being pulled out of hats in the upcoming budget.
It's been a long August, Joe. We'll leave it there, I think, with carrots and hats and sticks. Thank you, Joe Twyman, co-founder of Delta Poll, 12 after 7. Let's put this to James Matthewson, who's a former Labour Party spokesperson and joins me now. Thanks for coming on board, sir. Again, same question to you, and taking on board what Joe's just said. It is late August, but it is a bit of a drop. How concerning should it be in your view? Good morning.
Good morning, Nick. I think it is concerning in the sense that any drop in any polling is always concerning. However, I think, as you've just pointed out, and as Joe's pointed out correctly, we've got time yet to worry about this. And I think Keir Starmer, being Keir Starmer, is somebody who is not hugely bothered right now about what that means, right? You've got two different things, haven't you, here? You've got somebody who can win an election as one personality type, and you've got somebody who can run a country as another personality. I mean, this is the fascinating thing with our democracy, is they are two completely different things. And I think Keir Starmer is somebody who is good at running things, as we saw with the CPS. But, I mean, at the same time, there was always this question about his electoral credibility. Now, he's passed that hurdle, and I think what he's thinking now is, I need to govern. And really, if I look at these polls all the time and become obsessed with them, then, you know, I'll end up like Tony Blair. I'll be restrained in certain areas. I'll be too bothered about the public image. However, the risk is, of course, he becomes Gordon Brown and he doesn't pay any attention to any polls. He doesn't pay any attention to any publicity and just puts his head down, says everyone will be fine with it, and then it ends exactly the way as it did for Gordon Brown.
The position you enjoyed within the Labour Party, taking you back a few days to that speech in the Rose Garden, was he too much of a gloomster? There wasn't a lot to inspire, James.
Yeah, I'm still confused about what I think about this, Nick, because I've had people reaching out to me who, you know, politics people and non-politics people saying, what's going on? Is everything going to be okay? Are we headed for some diabolical crash? And this is because nobody's used to somebody sitting down and saying something that serious since the COVID pandemic. I mean, that's the kind of recent PTSD for everyone, right? Is the leader of the country addressing everybody publicly saying things are going to be horrendous is the COVID memory. So I think people are panicking from it. I don't know if they've kind of overestimated or underestimated that, but we will see how it plays out after the budget, I think.
Enjoyed our time, James. Have a good weekend. James Matthewson, thank you, former Labour Party spokesperson. Let's put the numbers to this then. So Sir Keir finds himself, as I say, with that 27% drop. It's worth reminding you, by the way, that the turnout at the last general election was the second lowest in 150 years at 59.8%. And 34% of that went to the Labour Party, although a phenomenal victory, as I've said all along. But he's now down to minus 16. So to put that in context, and we're only using prime ministers who had won general elections, so not those who assumed power, like Liz Truss or Rishi Sunak. So if we go back chronologically, at the same point for Boris Johnson, he was up 3. Theresa May was down 25, but she'd made that calamitous decision to call the election. David Cameron was up 7 in the second of his elections. He was up 31 at this point in his first general election. And Tony Blair was enjoying increases of 10 points and 65 points. That was after his first win, of course. Sir Keir's at 11. So what would your rating be? At minus 11, did I say 11? Sir Keir is at minus 11. What do you put it down to? I'm happy to revisit the idea of that winter fuel allowance, possibly the pubs, the smoking ban, which I think is very ill thought through. Or is he taking on those challenges? Someone had to.